Zoo decks, and how do you feel like they're doing right now?
I feel like Silas has a pretty good description of zoo decks and how they generally work. Something I want to highlight about how buff spells interact with zoo decks is that generally your buff options, things like Nurtured Bond, Dawnblade, hell, even Stonefist, they're generally balanced by the fact that buff options like that tend to be what are called minus ones. You kind of play them, and then you're just down a card. So you've got to try and make up value elsewhere. Buff cards can still be very strong because they put immediate stats on board, but you also need to have like units to use them. And also, if I just buff a unit, swing in for a little bit of damage, and then you immediately kill it, well, I've invested a lot of resources and that's lost. Zoo decks are able to kind of get around that problem because they get their units a lot more efficiently, especially something like, suppose the turn 1 like Shogun Nico opening just gives you a 3-5 and a 1-4 with guard and lead on turn 2 because you can just like mana potion that out. That is already very hard to answer considering how much health those units have. You slap Aqua Sword onto one of those things and it's a very safe investment because you've already got a lot of stats. And whenever you have all these other like swarmy options that Silas mentioned, things like Gus and a Songbird make a perfect example, you kind of spread out the value. So that's kind of why those like buff options tend to work well with Zoo. I'll also agree that, yeah, the lack of wisdom definitely helps Zoo. Normally, you can kind of swamp out those decks with things like Nurture or Nature's Grasp, or my personal favorite, and by favorite, I mean I hate this card, Whelm. Whenever those things aren't around, those are some of the biggest checks for Zoo decks.
A lot of people are pretty negative feelings towards Whelm, but that is because it is such a good counter, and it's such a good counter to such a specific thing, low cost units, that decks that their whole goal is low cost units that can really screw up their whole plan, and it also puts them back in your hand, which usually, if you have a big board, makes you overdraw. Can be really frustrating for players that are trying to, build value, build into upcoming turns, and now their turns are screwed up and they don't have a board anymore. I understand, but it's a check, like you said, and once you see less wisdom, you see less whelm, you see less overdraft, you see less nature's bond, and it comes out to eat.
Yeah.
Another aspect to consider is that when you are playing a Zoo deck and the game develop into mid game, you are expecting to face against AoE spells that deals like 3 damage or 4 damage. So you would really like to buff the weaker units to above the AoE threshold. So even if your opponent plays some kind of AoE spells, some of your units will survive. But that's not the case for Whelm, because Whelm does not care how much you buff your
Nope.
unit. You just return whatever to your
Nope,
hand.
it's
right?
whelmed.
So I really, yeah.
That's a
Yeah.
good point, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes it frustrating for like Mira Will or Anima, as you called it, because your one costs are sometimes like 6 7s or something, and then now they get returned to your hand, and when they get returned to your hand, they also lose the buff and the Anima, and now you're just left with a 1 2 and being like, I don't want this.
Yeah, whelmed.
Yeah.